Cowboy's pregnant wife was dying in labor. A healer widow saved them and gained a husband. The candle had burned down to about 2 inches when I heard her stop screaming. That was worse. I want you to understand that. The screaming was bad. God, it was bad, hearing Nora like that through the floorboards, through the planks I'd laid myself 6 years ago when we first built this place, each one fitted and nailed in the long good summer before she came out from Ohio to marry me. But the silence that came after it was a different kind of terrible. The kind that sits on your chest like a stone slab and doesn't announce itself, just settles. I was on the porch. I had no business being in that room. Dorothea Crane, who'd come out from town, had told me plain when we arrived. "You'll be in the way, you'll upset her. Go stand outside and let me work." So I stood outside. I gripped the porch rail until the wood bit into my palms, and I stood outside in the dark, and I listened to my wife fight for her life in our bedroom, 12 feet and 1 wall away, and I could do nothing about it. We were 12 miles from town. It was the middle of October, which out here means the cold had already come down off the ridgeline and moved in to stay. Frost on the grass by nightfall. The stars that night were sharp and closed the way they get when the air has gone dry and cold, and they didn't care one thing about what was happening in that house. Stars never do, which is something you notice when you need them to. Nora was 31 years old. This was our first child after 3 years of trying, 2 of those years with nothing to show for it, one of those years with a loss at 4 months that she didn't talk about and I didn't make her. We had wanted this and we had worked toward it, and we had been afraid of wanting too much, which is a thing you learn after loss, how to keep some part of yourself in reserve so there's something left if the thing doesn't hold. And now this. 8 months and 3 weeks, and something had gone wrong with the way the baby was lying, and Dorothea had said quietly, not looking at me straight, that it might be a difficult night. She had been a midwife for 30 years. When a woman who has done something for 30 years calls a situation difficult, you pay attention to what she's not calling it. I had ridden for Dorothea myself at sundown when Nora's pains came on hard and too fast and too close together, 12 miles there and 12 miles back on a horse that I pushed harder than I should have. The horse was young and he forgave me for it. My name is Cal Reeves. I had a ranch then, still do, though it looked different after that night, looked like more than it ever had before, looked like something worth keeping, 160 acres on the East Fork of the Powder, a small herd that was decent enough, a barn I was proud of, a house I'd built with 2 hired hands and considerable swearing. I was 44 years old. I am not a man who prays much, but I was praying that night, though I couldn't have told you to what exactly, to the cold air, to the sharp stars that weren't listening, to whatever was in there with Nora that might decide to be merciful. Dorothea came out after the silence. She pulled the door behind her and stood at the edge of the porch light, and her face said things her mouth wasn't ready to say yet. She was a good woman, Dorothea. 60 years old, stout, the kind of calm that comes from seeing too much to be rattled by most things. But she was rattled. I could see it in the set of her jaw and the way she took a breath before she started. "The baby's turned wrong," she said. "I've tried to shift it, I can't. I've tried everything I know how to do." I waited. "Nora's bleeding more than she should be. I've slowed it some." She stopped. She looked at me with those straight old eyes, eyes that had seen a great deal and had learned not to spare you from what they knew. "Cal, I've lost women this way." I heard what she didn't say. "There's a woman," she said, "lives about 4 miles east off the creek cabin set back in the cottonwoods. She came out here from Missouri 2 years ago. Her name is Adeline Marsh. Her husband died the first winter, don't know the full particulars, a fever of some kind that hit the lungs, and she stayed on alone, which most people thought was plain foolishness for a woman by herself, but she's still there and she keeps herself and she works hard. She's a healer, Cal. Not doctoring, not exactly, but she knows things. Birth things especially. I've heard of her pulling a cord case and a breech case both and coming out right on both sides. I don't know if every part of what I've heard is true, but I've tried everything I know how to try." She held my eyes. "I can't tell you what your chances are either way," she said, "but I would go get her if it was mine to do." I had my coat on before she finished the sentence. I had my hat and my gloves, and I was off that porch and into the barn with a lantern before I'd let myself think about what I was going to find when I came back, before I'd let myself sit even for a second with what it meant that Dorothea Crane, who had 30 years of this, was telling me to ride for someone else. That is the only way to move when everything is coming apart around you. You do not sit with it. You do not look at it directly. You find the next thing that needs doing and you do it, and the next thing after that, and you keep your hands busy because your hands are the part of you that still works. The horse I took was the gray, the one I called Kite, because he had speed in him that the others didn't, a kind of wire-tight quickness in his haunches that you could feel the moment you put your heels to him, like he was spring-loaded, like he'd been waiting. I put my heels to him. The lantern swung on the saddle ring and threw orange light across the frostbitten grass, and I rode east into the dark with the stars overhead not caring and Nora's silence still sitting on my chest like that stone slab. 4 miles in the dark is not far if you're not thinking about what you left behind. It is a very long way if you are. The cottonwoods were black shapes against a slightly lighter sky when I found them, bare already in October, and the creek whispered somewhere off to the left, and there was a cabin set back maybe 100 yards from the tree line with no light in the window, dead dark. The kind of dark a place goes when a person has been asleep in it for some hours. I didn't slow down. I came to the door on horseback and I hit it with my fist 3 times, 4 times, and I called out, "Mrs. Marsh." "My name is Cal Reeves. I'm on the East Fork of the Powder. My wife is in labor and she's in trouble and Dorothea Crane sent me to you. Please, if you can hear me, please come to this door." Nothing for a long 10 seconds. I counted them. Then a light behind the window. Then the sound of a bar lifting. Then the door opened and a woman stood in it holding a candle, her hair loose around her shoulders, a shawl pulled around her nightgown, and her eyes were already alert in a way that told me she'd been most of the way awake already, or that she woke fast and fully, which is a skill some people have and some people don't. Some people come up from sleep slow and foggy. She came up clear. She was, I don't know what I expected. Something older maybe, something harder. She was somewhere near 40, dark-haired, gray starting to come in at the temples, a face that was plain until you looked at it a second time and realized it wasn't plain at all. It was still. Still like deep water, the kind that doesn't show what's under it until you've been around it a while. She looked at me, at a man she had never seen in her doorway in the middle of the night, in the middle of a cold October, breathing hard with a sweating horse behind him, and she did not look afraid. She looked like she was calculating. "How long has she been in labor?" she said. It was not a question with much of a question mark. It was a question aimed like a tool. "Since before sundown," I said. "Dorothea Crane is with her. She says the baby's turned wrong and Nora's bleeding." "Her first?" "Yes." "How old is your wife?" 31. "What's your name?" "Cal Reeves." She was already turning back into the cabin. "Get my horse from the lean-to," she said. "Sorrel mare, she's not hobbled. There's a bridle on the first peg left of the door. I'll be 2 minutes. She was 1 minute and 45 seconds. I didn't count deliberately, but the brain does what it does in extremity, and I was counting inside my head the whole time I was in the lean-to, finding the mare, finding the bridle, getting it on her in the dark with cold hands that weren't working as well as I needed them to. The mare was calm. Good temperament, that horse. She didn't shy at the lantern or at the stranger handling her. Adeline Marsh came out of the cabin carrying a canvas bag that looked heavy and a second smaller one, and she took the reins from me without asking and went up on that mare without a mounting block or a hand. Just swung up clean the way somebody does it who's done it 10,000 times and doesn't give it any thought. She looked at me and said, "Lead me." I led her. We went back the way I'd come, and she didn't ask me anything else, and I didn't offer anything else. She rode close behind me, not hanging back, not nervous about the dark, just present and moving. There was no conversation in either of us. We both understood what we were riding toward, and we both understood that what mattered now was speed and not wasted breath. The only sound was the hooves in the frost, and the creek fading behind us and the wind coming off the ridge, and the particular hollow sound. The night makes out here when you're moving through it fast. Kite had run 24 miles before morning, there and back again, and he earned every oat I gave him the rest of his natural life. But I'm ahead of myself. When we got back, Dorothea met us at the door. She looked at Adeline Marsh with an expression I would call relieved if that word were big enough for what her face did. Something in her shoulders came down about 1.5 inches, something she'd been holding without knowing she was holding it. Adeline went past me into the house without looking back. I heard her and Dorothea speaking low inside, their voices quick and technical, the way 2 people talk when they both know the work and don't need to explain the basics to each other. Then the bedroom door closed, and I was on the porch again. I sat down on the step this time. I couldn't stand any more. Kite was tied at the post, and I could hear him shifting his weight, and the frost was making the grass catch the lantern light and throw it back in small, cold sparks, and the candle on the sill had maybe an inch left in it, and I sat with my hat in my hands and my elbows on my knees, and I waited. I have done hard things. I have worked cattle in weather that would keep a sane man inside, cold and wind and mud that pulls at your boots and doesn't let go. I have set my own broken finger after a horse fell on my hand on a roundup in my 30s, set it and splinted it with a stick and a strip of my shirt, and kept working. I have buried a father and a mother and a brother who died young, too young, a fever that took him in 3 days when we were both boys, and I was old enough to understand what was happening, and too young to do one thing about it. I have waited out a twister in a root cellar listening to my roof come off plank by plank overhead. Each plank I'd nailed myself, and I have come up out of that root cellar into a clear blue sky and a wrecked yard, and I started picking up the pieces before the dust settled. Sitting on that step was harder than any of it, and I have thought about why that is in the years since. I think it is because all those other hard things I was in, I was part of them. I was working or enduring or moving or making some kind of difference, however small, to the outcome. On that step I was nowhere. I was outside the thing that was happening. This is what nobody tells you about loving someone the way I loved Nora. It's not the good parts that cost you. It's the parts where you have all of your capability and none of your usefulness. I could build a barn. I could throw a calf in mud and cold and come up grinning. I could work 16 hours and rise at 4 and do it again because the work required it. But I could not walk through that bedroom door and do the thing that needed doing in there, and that helplessness sat in me like a coal, hot and low, and there was nothing to do with it. So I sat and I waited, and the stars moved the way stars do, slowly in their indifferent arcs. I heard the baby cry at 10 minutes past 2 in the morning by my pocket watch. It was not a big cry. It was the thin, surprised cry of something brand new to the world, something discovering that air is a thing and lungs are a thing and this is how they work. But it was a cry. It was alive and crying, and I put my face in my hands right there on that step, and I stayed that way for a while, breathing into my palms, feeling the cold on the back of my neck, feeling something in me unwind that had been wound too tight for too many hours. Adeline Marsh opened the door at 20 past 2. She had blood on her apron and on her forearms, and she was wiping her hands on a cloth, and she looked at me on that step with those still, deep eyes, and she said, "You have a daughter. She's small, but she's strong. Her color is good." She paused. "Nora lost a fair amount of blood. She's weak, and she's going to need time and care and rest, but I believe she's past the worst of it." I stood up. I don't remember standing, but I was standing. "She wants to see you," Adeline said. And she stepped aside. I went in. I will not tell you everything about what happened in that room, because some things belong between a man and his wife and the walls of the house they built together. I will tell you that Nora was white as flour in the lamplight, and she had dark circles under her eyes that I had never seen before, and there was a baby on her chest, red-faced and small, and wrapped in the blue flannel blanket Nora had sewn through the summer, sewing it a little every evening after supper while I read or mended something, and she'd held it up once and said it was big enough to wrap a whole person and laughed at herself. Now it wrapped our daughter. Nora looked up at me when I came through the door and she smiled, and it was the most tired smile I have ever seen in my life, and it was the best thing I have ever seen. I sat on the edge of the bed. I put my hand over both of them, over Nora's hand and over the small warmth in the flannel. I didn't say anything. I wasn't capable of saying anything that would have been worth saying. After a while, I remembered to thank something for the outcome, and I pointed it in the direction of whatever had been listening that night, if anything had been. Adeline Marsh stayed the night. She slept, or I assume she slept, on the settee in the front room, and in the morning when I came out at 5 to light the stove, she was already up, had already fed the fire from my wood box, and was sitting with a cup of coffee at the kitchen table. Her hair was back up now, pinned plain. She had washed her apron, and it was hanging near the stove to dry. She looked at me without any particular expression when I came in, just the same still quality she'd had at her cabin door at 2 in the morning. "Coffee's fresh," she said. "I hope you don't mind, I needed it." "I don't mind," I said. I poured a cup and sat across from her, and we drank in quiet, the way people do when they've been through something together in the same night, and don't need to describe it to each other because they were both there and they both know what it cost. After a while I said, "I owe you more than I can say." She looked at her cup. You don't owe me anything. Dorothea sent you. You rode out in the cold and the dark and you got there and back. I did what I know how to do." She paused. "The baby's going to need watching. She's early enough that the first weeks matter a great deal. And Nora should have someone with her who knows what to look for. Dorothea has others she tends. She can't stay." I hadn't thought that far ahead yet. I'd made it to the morning, and that was as far as I'd gotten. "I can come back," she said. "If you need someone." She said it simply, the way you state a practical arrangement, not as a kindness particularly, as a fact about what was needed and what she could provide. "It's not far." I said I'd be grateful for that. She rode out after breakfast. I watched her go from the porch, the sorrel mare picking her way down the frost-pale trail between the bare fields, and I stood there until she disappeared around the bend, and then I went back in to check on Nora and the girl. Adeline came back 2 days later. She came on foot, which surprised me, until I saw the state of the trail after the night's rain and understood that the mud would have made a horse more trouble than it was worth. She had walked 4 miles through October mud with that canvas bag and the smaller one, and she knocked on my door like she was delivering something she'd promised and said, "How's the baby's latch? Is she taking milk?" That was the start of it, her coming and going. She came every 2 or 3 days through those first weeks, checking on the baby, checking on Nora, leaving things I didn't always know the purpose of, small bundles of dried plants I couldn't name, a piece of bark she steeped into a tea for Nora's recovery, a particular salve for the baby's skin where it had gone dry and tight in the cold air. She didn't explain everything she did, and I didn't ask her to. There are people in this world who know things that work, and you don't interrogate a thing that works. You watch it and you give it room. Nora liked her. I should say that plainly because it mattered and it shaped everything. Nora is a woman who makes up her mind about people fast and usually correctly, and she took to Adeline in the quick, sure way that 2 strong and practical women recognize each other. I'd come in from the barn sometimes and hear them talking in the back room, low and easy, the kind of conversation that doesn't have any performance in it, just 2 people thinking out loud at each other. That was good for Nora. We were far from her family in Ohio, far enough that she didn't get back more than once every year or 2. She didn't complain about the distance. It wasn't her way to complain, but I knew the loneliness was there. You can know something about a person without them saying it. I made sure Adeline's horse was watered and fed when she rode out. I made sure there was a meal if she was there near dinner time, which she sometimes was. I split extra wood one Saturday when I knew she was out on a call of some kind and rode over to her place and stacked it under the linta where it would stay dry. She didn't mention it when she came next, but I could see from the linta that she was working through it steadily, which was the point. I will not draw this out past where it honestly went at first. It wasn't anything beyond neighbor and neighbor, one person in a tight spot and another person with the means to help and the decency to use them. I had a wife I loved and a baby daughter I was still getting used to and a ranch that needed working regardless of what I felt like. Adeline had her own life and her own place, and the particular private life that a widow builds around herself partly because she has to and partly because it becomes familiar. You stop expecting company, and you arrange yourself around its absence. But things shift. That is the truthful way to say it. Things shift slowly and then faster in ways you don't always see until you're already in them. Nora recovered the way I had believed she would, which is to say steadily and without complaint, and with more concern for the baby and for me than for herself. By December, she was up and solid, and Ruth, we named the baby Ruth, which had been Nora's mother's name, was filling out, getting pink in the cheeks, starting to make the small, opinionated sounds that babies make when they're figuring out that noise is something they can make, and that it produces results. Adeline's visits became less about checking on a patient and more about something that didn't have a medical name. She'd come on a Sunday sometimes just to sit, to have coffee, to hold Ruth while Nora got an hour with her hands empty, to be somewhere that had people in it, and a fire going, and the particular warmth of a house that was being lived in. I started to learn things about her in the way you learn things about a person who doesn't volunteer much. Not from declarations, but from the small, unguarded things. What she looked at when she came in the door, what she asked about, what made her go quiet. She had come from Missouri with her husband Thomas 2 years before, and Thomas had died in February of that first year. A lung fever that came on fast and didn't quit, and she had buried him on the place and stayed. She had no family she was close to in Missouri, and she said the land had taken hold of her in a way she hadn't been prepared for. The way this country does to some people, gets into you past the point where you can argue with it. She had learned healing from her mother, who had learned it from hers. Women who for generations had handled things that waited for no doctor and cared about no doctor. And she kept at it out here because people needed it, and because it was the truest thing she knew how to do with herself. She said it once, nearly those exact words, the truest thing she knew how to do with herself. I turned that over for a long time. There are a lot of ways a person can spend a life, a lot of ways to be competent, and a lot of things competence can attach itself to. But to know the truest use of your own particular competence, and to be doing it, that seemed like something worth holding on to. She was a woman who worked hard without making any noise about it. I noticed that the way you notice something once and then can't stop noticing it. The way she moved through a room, economical and decided. The way she talked to Ruth, directly, without the falseness some people put on around babies, just a real voice addressing a real person who happened to be very small. The way she looked at the land when she came up the trail, the way her eyes moved across it, like she was checking it for something, taking inventory, the same way I looked at it. I noticed and I held it, and I didn't say anything, because there was nothing to say and because I knew my own situation and wasn't going to dishonor it, or the woman who'd saved my wife by letting my thoughts get ahead of my sense. Nora saw it before I did. Nora tends to. We were in bed in late December, the wind working at the shutters, Ruth asleep in the cradle. We'd moved into our room, and Nora said, out of no particular conversation, "She's good." I said, "Who is?" Nora turned and looked at me with the expression that means I'm not fooling her and should stop trying. "Adeline," she said. "She's a good woman, Cal." I said yes, she was. "I think she's lonely," Nora said. "She wouldn't tell you that, but I can see it. There's a particular kind of loneliness in someone who's used to having someone and now doesn't, and she's got it." A pause. "She could use something to belong to." Then she turned over and went asleep. I lay there in the dark with the wind at the shutters and the baby making small sounds in the cradle and the cold pressing at the windows. And I thought about what that meant, and I thought about whether I was reading more into it than was there. I wasn't. January was a hard one. The cold that year wasn't just cold, it was the kind that makes the air itself seem dangerous, that gets into the wood of the house and makes it crack at night, that freezes water in the trough before you can get to it in the morning. I lost 2 cattle over the course of 10 days despite doing everything right, which is a particular kind of loss because you can't point to a mistake and say there, "That's the thing I'll do different." Sometimes you do everything right and you still lose, and you just have to put that away and keep going. Hard work in weather like that takes something out of you. Your hands stop working the way they should. Your joints carry the cold in them through the day. There are mornings when you stand at the barn door looking at what needs doing, and you have to talk yourself across the threshold the same way you would have had to at 20, like the experience doesn't count for anything when it's cold enough. I hadn't heard from Adeline in 10 days. That was sense enough in that kind of cold. A 4-mile ride for a social call wasn't worth it. Nobody would have thought twice about staying in. But I found myself wondering about the flu she'd mentioned back in November, how it pulled poorly in a north wind, and whether her woodpile was holding, and whether she had what she needed out there alone. On the 11th day, I saddled Kite and rode east. She came to the door when I knocked, and her expression was mildly surprised, which I noted because it was the first time I'd seen surprise on her, mild or otherwise. She had been doing something with her hands. There was a stain on her apron that looked like it might be ink, and she was wearing a heavy wool sweater over her dress, the kind of practical ugly sweater you wear when nobody's coming. "Just checking on you," I said. "Wanted to make sure the flu was pulling all right in this cold." She looked at me for a moment. "I fixed the damper in November," she said, then, "Come in, the coffee's fresh." I came in. Her cabin was something I hadn't really taken in the first time, coming to it in the dark and in urgency. It was small but not cramped, which is a thing that depends more on who lives in a space than on how many square feet it has. Things were arranged with a kind of precision that wasn't fussiness, just attention. Books on the shelf that had been read, dried plants hanging from the rafters in bundles, some of which I recognized and most of which I didn't. A small framed picture on the wall near the window that I couldn't make out clearly from where I sat. 2 chairs near the stove at angles that suggested she sat in one of them regularly, and the other one sat empty, which told you something about the past 2 years. She poured the coffee and sat down in the chair that was clearly hers, the one with the wear in it, and she put her hands around the cup and said, "How's Ruth?" "Fat and loud," I said. "She found her voice last week. Nora says she got that from me." Something moved in Adeline's face that wasn't quite a smile. Close. We talked for close to an hour, which was more than I'd intended when I saddled up, or more than I'd admitted I'd intended. About the cold and what it was doing to the range. About a family she'd gone out to see in November who'd come west from Pennsylvania and were having their first real winter on the frontier, stripped down to what it actually was, and not what they'd been told to expect. About a mare I had that had been favoring her right foreleg in a way I couldn't diagnose, and she asked me about it with the same focused quality she brought to everything, asking the right questions, the questions that would help her understand rather than just the questions that came naturally. At some point I said, "You never thought about going back east?" She was quiet for a moment. She looked at the stove. "I thought about it," she said. "After Thomas died, I thought about very little else for a while, but there wasn't anything back in Missouri that was waiting for me specifically. And out here," she stopped, started again differently. "Out here I've been useful. That's not a small thing to me. That is maybe the least small thing there is, to be useful where you are." I knew exactly what she meant. I didn't know how to say that I knew. "No," I said, "it's not a small thing." She looked at me then, not the still private look she usually kept. Something more open than that, something that didn't look away when it should have, something that held for a second past the length of a practical exchange. And I felt it move through me the way a shift in the weather moves through you before you can name what's changing, just a difference in the air. I rode home with my collar up against the cold and kite blowing steam, and I carried it with me the rest of the day. Nora's birthday was in February, and I made a meal out of it, which I did not always manage to do right but made an effort on. Adeline was there. Nora's birthday fell on a Sunday that year, and it seemed right to ask her, and Nora had said yes, ask her, before I finished forming the question. I am not an elaborate cook, I do not pretend to be. But I am competent when I apply myself, and I applied myself. There was a roasted chicken that came out well, and biscuits, and a cake because Nora likes cake, and Ruth sat in her chair and watched the proceedings with the expression of someone who is taking detailed notes on everything. Adeline had brought Nora a small gift, something she'd made herself, a length of woven fabric in a pattern I didn't recognize, but that Nora touched and then looked up with an expression that meant it was something she knew, something from somewhere she'd come from. They spoke about it in that low, particular way for a minute, and then it was put aside and the meal went on. After dinner, Nora went to put Ruth down, which took considerably longer than planned because Ruth had a great deal to say about whether she was ready to sleep. And Adeline and I were at the table with the last of the coffee and the remains of the cake between us. And the house was quiet in the way it gets when the wind isn't up and the night is clear and still. She said, looking around the room, taking in the walls and the ceiling, the way the window sat flush and square, "You built this yourself." "Most of it," I said. "Hired 2 men for the heavy framing, most of the rest was me." "It's a good house," she said. "You can tell when someone built a thing to last. There's a quality in it. Thomas and I built ours together. He was more skilled at it than me, but he let me work alongside, wouldn't let me just watch." She put her hand flat on the table for a second, feeling something in the solidity of it. "I miss that, having something to work alongside." I said, "You've been working alongside us for 4 months. She looked at me. "That's different." "Is it?" A long quiet, the fire. Ruth's voice somewhere down the hall, still negotiating. "Cal," she said, slow and careful with my name the way she was careful with things she wasn't sure of. "I don't know what you're asking me." "I think you do," I said. She looked at her hands. Then she looked at me, and there was nothing still or private in her eyes right then. She was just looking at me directly, and she said, "Are you asking me what I think you're asking me?" "If you'd be willing," I said. "If it's something you'd want. I'm not a young man, and I'm not always an easy man, and I know you've made something of your own out here, and I wouldn't ask you to put that down. But I think you'd be good here. I think this place is better when you're in it, and I know what I think when I think about you 4 miles away in that cabin alone." I stopped. I am not a man built for talking about what I feel. I never have been, and I held to plain words because plain was what I had. I know what I want. I thought I should say so. She was quiet long enough that I thought I'd read the whole thing wrong, gotten so far ahead of myself that I'd invented what I thought I'd seen. Then she said, very quietly, "I think about that too." We were married in May, when the grass was coming in and the ranch looked the way it looks in that particular 2-week window in late spring when everything is new, and the light has a quality to it that makes you understand why people stayed, why they came back, why they built things in places this hard and this beautiful. Not a large ceremony. Nora stood with Adeline. A friend of mine I'd known since we were young stood with me. A preacher came out from town who did the thing properly and at a sensible length. Ruth, by then nearly 7 months old and firmly settled in her view that she was the most interesting person in any room, slept through most of it in a basket at Nora's feet, and Adeline looked down at her during the vows with an expression that was private and real. We moved Adeline's things to the ranch over the course of a week. Her cabin on the creek she kept because people needed her and she needed to be reachable, and I didn't argue with that. It was part of who she was. You don't marry a woman who heals people and then ask her to stop, any more than you'd marry a rancher and ask him to give up his land. You make room. You make sure the horse is ready when she needs it at 2 in the morning, and you make sure the lamp is trimmed, and you keep something warm on the stove for when she comes in late. The first year of a marriage built on that kind of beginning is a particular thing. We already knew each other in ways that couples usually take years to arrive at, if they arrive at all. She had seen me at a stripped-down moment, not broken. I wouldn't call it broken, but stripped of everything but what was essential. The night I was nothing but a man who couldn't fix the thing that most needed fixing. And I had seen her at her most essential. The woman in the doorway at 2 in the morning with the candle and the clear eyes. A woman who had every right to say it was the middle of a cold night, and she didn't know me from any other stranger come riding out of the dark. She'd made a different choice. There are things about her I was still learning a year in and am still learning now. The way she thinks before she speaks, really thinks, actually waits for the word that's right instead of the word that's close. The way she moves in the barn, easy and unafraid, the animals taking to her faster than I would have predicted. The way she reads in the evening with the book held close and her finger sometimes following a line she wants to hold on to. The way she woke one night in January of that first married year and sat straight up in the dark and said she thought the Haverson boy had a fever. She'd seen something in his color 2 days before that she couldn't stop thinking about, and she needed to ride out. I got up and saddled her horse without being asked and didn't say a word about the hour or the cold, and she was gone before the room had warmed back up. She came home at 3 in the morning. I was up. I'd kept the stove going and there was food. She came in and took off her coat and stood there for a moment, the way you stand when you've used everything you had and you're recalculating what you have left. Then she sat down, and I set the food in front of her and sat across from her and let her eat without talking. After a while, she looked up from her plate and looked at me across the table and said, "The boy is going to be all right." "Good," I said. She held my eyes. There was something in her face I hadn't seen before or hadn't seen named like this. Then she stood up and crossed the room and put her arms around me, and she is not generally a demonstrative woman. She doesn't reach for people often, and I felt the weight of it, the significance of the gesture from this particular person. And I put my arms around her, and she stood there with her face against my shoulder, and she said, quiet into my collar, "You are a good man, Cal." I didn't say anything. I just held her there in the warmth of our kitchen while the cold did its work outside and the house was still. There were men in that valley who had known me for years and who would not have put those 2 words together about me, or wouldn't have thought to, and some of them had reasons I wouldn't argue with. I was not always patient. I was not always easy to know. I had done things in my younger years out of pride or stubbornness that I would choose differently now. I was not what you'd call remarkable in any particular direction. I was a man who ranched and worked and kept his word and tried to do things right, which is not a short list, but is not a distinguished one either. But she had said it. She had said it quiet and plain and with her arms around me in the kitchen at 3 in the morning, and she was not a woman who said things she didn't mean. I had learned that about her early, and I had never had cause to revise it. I think about that night more than I think about most nights. More than the wedding, even, or the night Ruth was born, or the ride to the cottonwoods in the dark with everything unraveling. It is that ordinary moment in the kitchen at a bad hour that stays with me most, because it was the moment I understood what I had fully, what I'd been given. What I had was a woman who had come into the worst night of my life and turned it, who had stayed when staying wasn't required. who had chosen this place and this man with her eyes open, knowing everything I was and wasn't, knowing the limitations of the life and the distance from town and the winters and the work that doesn't end, and she had looked at all of it and she had chosen it. She had called me good. You can do a great deal with that. You can get up before dawn every morning and go out into the cold and the work and the uncertainty and the years that keep coming with their particular demands, and you can do it with your back straight because something inside you is settled. Not what people think of you, not the size of your herd or the acreage or whether the town respects you or not. Something simpler and further down than all of that. Someone sees you. Someone with no obligation to stay stayed. Ruth is 3 now. She calls Adeline Mama, which settled itself without any prompting, and she calls me Papa with the particular conviction of a person who has decided something firmly and sees no reason to revisit it. She has Nora's eyes, and she has a will that is entirely her own, and that is going to be an education for all of us in the years ahead. Nora and Adeline move through this house together the way 2 good women move when they respect each other. Easy, productive, occasionally in conversation I can't quite follow and wisely don't try to. There are mornings I stand at the kitchen window with the coffee going on the stove, and the light is coming up across the grass, going gold and cold and clear, and I can see the barn and the pasture and the hills going blue in the early distance, and I hear Adeline come in from wherever she's been, checking on the colt that was born small, or doing the thing she does early in the morning that I have never quite caught. And she comes in and goes straight to the stove and stands there a moment with her hands around a cup, waking up slow the way she does in the morning, which is the one time of day she does anything slow, and then she looks over at me across the kitchen with those still, deep eyes. There's something in them that I don't have words good enough for. I've stopped trying. The frost is on the grass this morning. October again. Another year put down. Inside the house I can hear Ruth beginning to lay out her terms for the day and Nora's voice answering her and the sound of the stove door and Adeline moving through the kitchen. The valley is going gold. The hills are going gold. The sky is the particular hard, clean blue that only comes in October out here, a blue you could fall into and not find the bottom of. I've got work to do. There is always work to do. I put on my hat and I step off the porch into the cold morning, and the grass crunches under my boots, and the barn is waiting, and in the house behind me are 3 people who are mine and who I am theirs, and that is more than enough to walk toward. A man who has something to come back to can go anywhere.